Does opening up this file fill you with dread as much as it does me? It just, so many comments. It just goes on, and of course it's all very important. Is it necessary to be in your settings file all the time? If you remove the comments, this is what you're left with. Those lines. If you install Drupal through the UI, it adds the database and of course the config sync directory. So a lot of times what I've done in the past is done a sort of simplified version of settings, and so this is that same default settings file but with just a single line describing what each setting does, or what each line does. So fairly straightforward, and then loading additional files here at the bottom. So we're going to talk about settings and services and take a look at some solutions to some of the common problems that we see with managing settings and services in Drupal. I am Rick Hawkins. I lead the Drupal team at Slalom, which is a business and tech consulting company based out of Seattle, where I live. And we have about almost 50 offices around the world. And I'm an organizer for the Seattle Drupal user group, and also one of the planners for the Pacific Northwest Drupal Summit, which is coming up in October of this year. It's going to be outside of Portland. It should be a lot of fun. It's great to be back in Chicago. My first DrupalCon was here in Chicago in 2011, and I'm looking forward to coming back next year for DrupalCon 2026. I maintain a couple dozen modules on Drupal.org, where I am known as RL Hawk. So what we'll talk about today is we'll just sort of do an overview of settings and services, just so we're all kind of on the same page. We'll talk about our goals, what we're looking to do when we're managing these files, different strategies for how you might want to approach them, where I took my inspiration, and how you might be able to sort of adopt some of these for your projects, some of these ideas for your projects. And then the last half will be more of a demo. We'll look at code and get your ideas too. But feel free to raise your hand if any questions come up along the way, or anything you want to add comes to mind. So one question about Drupal settings is, how are they different from configuration? And the primary way is that Drupal settings are loaded during the bootstrap phase, when all of Drupal isn't fully loaded. So it's loaded very early. And if you think about it, configuration lives in the database. So we've got to have some way of connecting to the database even to get to that configuration. And so that database definition is defined in the settings file. And of course, there's a primary settings file. It's usually at under the sites directory in a file called settings.php. So an example of the kind of things you can do in that file are, that database connection I mentioned, define the hash salt, file system paths, etc. We'll take a look at each of these. So the database connection details look like this. Pretty straightforward. This is obviously for a local development environment, given the database username and password are all DB. The hash salt is used to enhance security for cryptographic operations, such as generating one-time login links and creating image style derivatives. It just adds an extra layer of complexity to those operations, so it makes it more difficult for attackers to retrieve the original data without knowing what the salt is. So it's recommended that you do not commit the salt to your repository, and you keep it secret.
A quick question about the hash salt.
Yeah.
Is that, does that have to stay the same? Kind of like how the config site UUID has to stay the same, like in install? can the hash salt change at all, or is that not allowed?
It can change. If you do that, you're going to invalidate your image style derivatives, because the image token, which this is used to generate, will not be the same anymore. And it may still work for some images if they've already been downloaded, or if they've already the derivatives have already been created. But any new ones, I guess it's more an issue if somebody has hard-coded a link to something with an italk equals, and now that's changed and it's no longer going to work. But there is a question. It is recommended that the hash salt be different per environment. But when I was doing research to see if it's recommended that it actually be different in a multi-site environment for each of the individual sites, there's no definitive answer there. It seems like that would be a good idea, just to add extra security, but I really haven't seen that. For the most part, I see a single hash salt for one Drupal installation.
Thank you.
Sure. And it's often read from a file, as you can see in this example. So the file will exist often outside of the web root. You don't want to, ideally you don't have any file that doesn't need to be in the web root, under the web root. You have them one level up, so you would have your salt file probably at the project root level. And if you've worked with BLT before, I think that's pretty much what it did, was generated the salt file and placed it at the project root. File system paths are defined in settings.php. So if you go to the configuration page, you'll see what these are defined to be, but you can't change them there. And I think that's partially for security, but also maybe these paths need to be available earlier on in the bootstrapping process, so you have access to the public file path and the private path. Public is defined by default to be in sites, whatever the site name is, /files. There is no default for private, so it'll be empty by default. You can't use the private files directory until you set that. Temporary is by default whatever the operating system's temporary directory is, and that's often /tmp. And then there is a new, a fairly recent addition, which is the file assets path, and that is for optimized CSS and JavaScript, so you can actually choose to have those files somewhere other than in your public files directory if you want to manage those somewhere else. And but the default is the same as the public file system path. Has anyone changed that directory to anything else other than the public files directory? I never have. But it's also fairly new. I think it was added in Drupal 10. Trusted host patterns are where you can define what hosts you're supporting in your Drupal site. So if it's a multi-site, you need to put all of them in here. It is a little bit arcane because it is regular expression. So you see, in this case, it's, it has to start at example and then have a literal period, and then that has to be the end. So in production, you would have this defined to be something like that top example, and then in development, it really doesn't matter. You're less concerned about it, so you can just set it to be .star, which is, it can be anything. We talked about the site configuration directory. By default, Drupal puts it in the public files directory. I think largely because that's the directory that it knows for sure it can write to, and it tries to sort of obscure it by adding a hash to the end of the file name. It's recommended that you move it outside of the web root, usually again to that project, the top level of the project. So you can see, in this case, we've got the web root, we're going up one level, and then the config directory is where those files, the configuration files, are going to live. There's a concept of a deployment identifier, and that's defined in settings.php. And The purpose of it is to invalidate the dependency injection container. I don't know if you ever ran into this issue, but it bit me and my team a couple of times where we deployed a new, we deployed a release that had a change to a service that adds, say, a new argument, which doesn't, so the parameter is not going to get passed through to the container until the container is invalidated and refreshed. What the deployment identifier does is automatically do that when the deployment identifier changes. So it will automatically invalidate the container. And in Drupal, in the default settings.php file, it defaults to the Drupal core version number. So that means whenever Drupal core changes, when you deploy, it will automatically invalidate your container so it can get refreshed and you won't get a white screen of death or PHP fatal error. But you may want this to be not only tied to Drupal core, maybe you want it to be every time you do a release, because then it would get your contributed modules, it would get your custom modules, anything you do that could possibly cause this same issue. So you can customize it to be whatever you want. Some people will use the last, the last hash from the hash from the most recent commit that right before it was the deployment. I've considered using just a date and time, like the last, when the deployment happened, because it's actually displayed. This deployment identifier is actually displayed on Drupal's status page, so you can actually see if you go into Drupal and you say, what am I looking at? I can see, the version of Drupal, but I don't know for sure which release this is. You can actually see that by looking at the deployment identifier. So you can see from Drupal's default, within settings.php, you set settings deployment identifier to the Drupal version, and then that will at least get you whenever it changes in Drupal core, whenever there's a new version of Drupal core, the deployment identifier will be updated. Configuration overrides, and this is where it gets a little confusing because you get this sort of blend between configuration and settings, but you can override configuration in a settings.php file. It's often used for environment-specific configuration, like configuration split is a very common use, and that the first line there shows that, so that we're setting the local config split status to be true when we're in our local environment. The environment indicator is another example. You can see here in this example too, I'm overriding the site's name to migrate website, and for some reason I'm doing it that way. The environment indicator, here's an example in Acquia. It's using an environment variable to determine which environment it is, and then setting the background color of the bar that appears up in the environment indicator to green for dev, blue for test, red for production, and then it sets the names. So it's in settings.php that you specify files that include service definitions or parameters. So this example from the default settings.php file shows that you say settings, container YAMLs, and then you add whatever services file you want to include. The default services file that would be included here does not include any new services. It is just parameters, and the reason for that is parameters are used so that you can have different behavior in different environments without needing to swap out the service altogether. So the parameters just get passed through to a given service, and they can have different behavior in different environments. And we'll take a look at that in a bit. So what are Drupal services? Broadly speaking, they are reusable, injectable objects. They're managed by Drupal service container. It's based on Symfony's dependency injection component. For purposes of this discussion, we're talking about the site level service definitions. Of course, you can define services in modules in a module name.services.yaml file. For site level services, like I say, the default is usually services.yaml, but you can add as many more as you want. Drupal comes with a default development services file, which does include some new services and some parameters that are appropriate for a development environment. So an example of the kinds of things you would use for a service are for logging, caching, mail handling. And again, these site level service definitions are important because they are available so early on in the Drupal bootstrapping process. So when we're thinking about how we want to manage these settings and services files, these are the 4 goals that I kind of came up with for the ways that I tend to think about it. I want it to be maintainable. That is, the files are easy to understand and update easily. I want them to be secure. Again, I don't want any files under the web root that don't need to be under the web root. I want it to be flexible and convenient for developers, for instance, to change their settings quickly. Let's say a front-end developer wants to turn on front-end development settings. The back-end developer doesn't care about front-end development settings, so they just want back-end development. We want it to be convenient and flexible for those developers. So for strategies, people have used BLT. No longer supported, but there is one of its dependencies was the Drupal recommended settings package, also maintained by Acquia, and that is still supported. And that's what I looked at first when I started thinking about my approach, and I actually adopted a lot of the patterns from that package. The reason why I didn't go with it is it has some hard-coded specifications for where the files live, and specifically they're going under the web root, and like I said, I would prefer they don't need to be there. I prefer that they be outside of the web root. So a lot of ideas came from that, but I sort of built on top of it and came up with some additional ones. So we're going to leverage included files, meaning we're not going to put everything in one big settings.php file. We're going to organize them into different settings files based on kind of whatever makes the most sense. You know, we might have some development ones. We might have our hosting platform file that is manages all of the settings for a specific hosting platform. And then you might have a deployment pipeline one that is specific for your CI/CD tooling, separate settings that you would need for that. Like I said, you want to keep those files outside of the web root. And for flexibility, I want to be able to have global definitions for settings that would apply to all sites. This is assuming I'm kind of planning for a multi-site environment or a setup, but it may not be the case, in which case you can kind of avoid some of the global and site-specific parts of this. You can just have a single group of settings, and they would apply to that one site. And then take advantage of Drupal's scaffolding capabilities, which were introduced around Drupal 8.8, I believe, to scaffold settings files and services, and even consider scaffolding the main settings file and services file. And I have a question mark next to that because it's an idea that I had, and I'll show how that works. But I'm still trying to weigh whether it's worth doing or not, whether it makes sense. Okay, before I get to the demo, any thoughts or questions? I'm going to expound on the strategies part that I just talked about. Okay. Is that big enough? Should I make it bigger?
A little, yeah.
Bigger. So, in my sites directory, I want this to be as clean as possible. And so, you see there's under the web root, sites, default. I have one settings file and one services file. The settings file is including all the includes that that we talked about. So where does that settings directory live? Again, outside the web root at the top level of the project. And you can see here are all the settings and services files, and they're all grouped by development. There are global settings, and we'll take a look at these one by one. This is sort of the main traffic controller. So this is what gets called from that site's settings.php file, the one that's actually in the sites directory. So this one first, determines if it's a development environment, and here I'm saying is it DDev, could be Lando. If you wanted to support both, you could have this. And then it includes, again, I mentioned that I want to have global settings, and then I want to have site-specific settings. So we see that right off the bat. There are global general settings for all sites, and then there are site-specific general settings. And so what that means is these are settings for all environments as well. And then the development settings come after that. So if it's a development environment, then we add the development settings, the general development settings, and then the site-specific development settings if they exist. So all of these get added to settings files, the settings files array, and then it loops through them and sees if they're there. If they aren't there, it doesn't complain, it just ignores them. And then we have some DDev specific settings. So things related to DDev get added at that point. And then here are those development settings that I mentioned where you may want to have back-end and front-end to be different settings files. So in this case, we've got settings, development, back-end. Now the front-end developer needs to have both back-end and front-end. So there are actually 3 development files. There's this one which has things like, it adds the development services file that Drupal provides, and then enables system logging, skips permission hardening, and then this trusted host patterns that I mentioned. And then here it's looking for a salt file. If it doesn't exist, it creates one and writes it, which you can see. It writes it into the same settings directory. And then it gets that and assigns it to the hash salt. And then you can see here, I'm assuming I'm using configuration split, and I'm enabling the local configuration split, setting it to true. So that's sort of the general development settings. For backend, it includes things like getting the backend services file loaded, disable the render cache, the internal page cache, dynamic page cache, so that kind of caching, but not front-end caching, because that's here in this file. And pre-process, CSS pre-processing and JS pre-processing are disabled. And it's bringing in the services file that's specific to front-end. And since there's often a debate about whether it should be development.settings.php, I've chosen to standardize on having settings first and services first, just because then all the settings are grouped together alphabetically and all the services are grouped together. And I do have a README that I include in here, which gives a description for what each of these does. So I described the main settings file as the one that includes all the others. It's sort of the top level manager. And then definitions for each of those things that I just mentioned, the development file, back end, front end, etc. Just going back to the main file, then local settings get added. And again, it uses that same pattern, global, and then site specific. And then here's that loop where it says, if any of these files exist, load them. I don't have anything in here related to platform hosting specific settings, but you would probably want to put those in here as well. Or CI/CD specific ones, anything else. And again, I recommend using this pattern of global and then site specific. And so you can see the site specific ones here. There's a sites directory, and for each site, I just have the one, but it has a settings file. Really the only thing that I have in here, well, it's bringing in a services file that doesn't have anything in it, but the trusted host patterns would be specific to this site, so you could have this be defined to be whatever that site is.
For the services, does it like do they all get combined, and then whatever the last included one is the one that takes precedence?
Good question. The question was around how the services files work together, because the later ones will, if it's defining the same thing as one that was earlier, how do those get put together? So there's, let me see if I can. So as I mentioned, the services.yaml file that you would use by default, the one that Drupal provides, is largely just parameters, parameter definitions. So if you're defining different parameters, you need to, if you define, for example, an override for session storage options, you need to define all of the child elements underneath it. It isn't, I forget what the term is when it's more sort of flexible about the way that it combines them. If you've defined session storage options, like that takes precedence over everything, and if you didn't specify GC probability, that's going to be empty. It's not going to take this and keep it. So you need to make sure that if you're overriding any of these, that you override every element that you want to. Otherwise, you may end up with values that are not what you expect. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. So let's see, did we finish? Let's take a look. So the main file, I mean, as complex as this looks, most of these files are pretty straightforward. You look at this and it's just general settings, development settings, local settings, and they're all, commented to give the information you need to understand that. And you can see there's some files that aren't being tracked by Git, the ones in gray here, for example, the salt. As we know, we don't want to keep that. The deployment identifier, actually we probably do want that to be tracked, so this should be not in Git again. You can see my deployment identifier for this example is the first 8 characters of the hash from the last commit. So I know it'll change whenever we deploy a new version. And this services.development, this is a core provided file. I have it renamed so to match, because I think by default in Drupal it's development.services.yaml. But I'm swapping it out and moving it in here so that it can be maintained. Like if it gets updated in the future by Drupal core, it will be automatically updated in my site. So taking advantage of the scaffolding capabilities that I hope all of you are as well, so that we're not tracking, we're not diverting from core's htaccess file. We're appending or prepending our specific, whatever we specifically need for the htaccess file to whatever core's providing. So that got me, so some of these files are actually scaffolded, and let's take a look at that. So Drupal scaffold is where you define the files that you want to have copied from one place to another. You can see that I've defined the settings directory here, and that's just this top level settings directory, but I can refer to it by this variable name every place that I need to refer to it. So here's where I'm setting that services.development.yaml file in the settings directory, and I'm getting it from Drupal core's development.services.yaml file. And so this is very easy to just define this, and that will get copied in whenever Composer install runs or Composer update. And then I'm also adding a scaffold file that I've defined, which is providing services.local.yaml, and it's set to overwrite false, meaning if it doesn't exist, it will get created, but if it already exists, it'll just ignore it. This is a file that is not meant to be tracked in Git. This is strictly for creating local services for your own development purposes and only for your local environment. So just taking a look at those scaffold files here. Here's that services.local. It's just an empty file with a single comment in it, but when Composer install runs, if it doesn't already exist, it will get placed in the settings directory. Same thing with settings.local. Yeah, there's settings.local. Again, not overwriting if it already exists. So doing this sort of scaffolding made me think sometimes settings.php in Drupal core gets updated. There's a new setting that becomes available, or something changes. And if you've created your own version and committed that, you're sort of now you've diverted from the Drupal core version, and if any changes happen, you would need to either be made aware of them through some other means by just watching for changes on Drupal.org in the change records or wherever. So I got to thinking, what if you actually were to scaffold that file and just use the default settings.php file? And so that's actually what I'm doing here. So you can see the post Drupal scaffold command. It runs these commands here. So there are a couple of patches that I run just to update some of those comments in it. But you can see it's moving the default services file to services.yaml for the default site, and the same thing for settings. And so what that does is it allows Drupal by default wants to put this default settings.php file in the default website's default directory, and I'm basically just renaming it to be the settings.php file and the services.yaml file that you see right here. And then under the scaffolding definition, you can see that I'm prepending a file that I created that adds to the services file, and I'm appending to the settings file the scaffold files that I have defined. So right here where it says default services prepend, it's basically just a warning not to edit the file and telling you where you need to go if you actually want to define services. So this will get prepended to Drupal core's the file that Drupal core contains, and will scaffold. And then the same thing for the settings file, but it puts this at the end, again saying do not edit this file. But the most important thing is that we're just bringing in that main settings file, and this is always going to be the case, and this will just get added automatically when Composer install runs. So if we look at the settings file, you can see it's that the content or the comment laden one that we saw earlier. This is just the default Drupal file with my scaffold with the appended scaffold file that I added. And again, it's just bringing in that main settings file, which then does all of the rest of the work. Services, like I said, it just is warning you not to edit this file. So you could do like a lot of the other scaffold files, like you can see here, index.php. I'm not tracking that anymore in Git. That gets scaffolded when Composer install runs. When Drupal updates that file, it will get updated automatically. I could do the same thing for settings and services. Starts to make me a little bit nervous. Like I would like to keep track of the changes that happen there. So I do actually commit this to the repository so that when I update Drupal and something changes, I will sort of see, there's a new setting that's available, and I can decide if I want to do something different with it, but at least it'll alert me to whenever there's changes to the default services file, the default settings file provided by Drupal. And then I can commit it and do whatever I need to do in my separate include files to handle whatever changes I want to make. So those are my ideas. I'm interested in how, what particular challenges you're facing that this doesn't solve, or other clever ways that you've addressed things. Maybe you think this is a little too clever. In some ways, I sort of think it does, but I was sort of took on the challenge to see if it would work, and I think I think it works pretty well. So, interested in anybody else's thoughts? Yeah.
Just some feedback. I think it's a really good idea. For some reason, I never thought about the setting PHP file being changed by core updates. I thought that's where you put your settings. You just do that.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a good concern. Interesting. Yeah.
Yes.
Still relatively new front-end developer who's trying to move into the back end, so this is still working on my understanding of this. What's the cascade like? So if you have the default services and then you don't have any of those services called out in your individual environment, do they just inherit anything that's not automatically called out?
The question was specifically around services and just how do they cascade, and it kind of speaks to the question earlier, if I'm understanding that later services will override services that are added later override ones that were added earlier. The parameters for them anyway. If we take a look at the services provided by the development services provided by Drupal core. Let's see. That's this file here. You can see it defines one parameter, which is this cacheability headers is set to true, and then it does define some new services, including this cache backend set to null, so you can actually then disable front-end caching or back-end caching, and then various other things for this. There's this logger service that gets added, and so I think that cascades in the way that the later ones override earlier ones. And I didn't mention something that if you took a look at this development, the main development settings. Actually, it's in main. So here, back-end and front-end development settings, you can see I'm using an environment variable to define which Drupal dev mode I'm in. Am I in back-end mode, front-end mode? Because one of the things that happens when you're doing local development is you have caching disabled, you have aggregation turned off, you have all these things, and then you deploy it and you find something isn't working the way you expected because you didn't test it locally with caching on and all the other things. So being able to turn off these development settings easily is important. And so that's why I went with the environment variable route. So, but there are different ways you could approach it. You could have, but I wanted to not have to edit a lot of files and like comment things out in order to turn caching off or on. You can just change this environment variable and you will get different results. So the environment variable, since I'm using ddev, I have the environment variable set. You can see here, Drupal dev mode you can set it to front end, back end, or you can leave it empty. And if you leave it empty, it'll be as if you're in production. So if you want to test this with, similar to a production environment, you could just make this empty, which maybe looks like that, perhaps. And then you have to restart DDev in order to get this environment variable. But it's pretty quick to be able to just turn caching on and off, change from front-end development to back-end development, and vice versa. More thoughts or questions?
Just what I use some of the things for is I'm currently doing a new theme on my site, so I just have it in my settings PHP. When I have the local environment variable, it just swaps out the other theme, so I can just push and not worry about screwing up my theme and stuff. So similar instance.
Okay, an alternative way. Yeah, lots of different ways to do it. As long as it's easy, that's all. I just need it to be like, especially if it's standardized across, you've got a bunch of developers working on the project, you can say like, here, just do this one thing and make sure you turn caching on and test before you deploy. Okay, well, if anyone has any other questions, look for me around and I'll be happy to chat with you about it. Thanks.